Stop. She's not who you think she is. Mathew suddenly exclaimed, his voice echoing through the chapel, leaving everyone in stunned silence. All eyes turned towards the young boy, while his father James looked at him with shock and confusion, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Mathew, a 9-year-old boy, had always possessed a strong sense of right and wrong. He firmly believed in protecting those he loved, no matter how difficult or dangerous it might be. And on this day, supposedly the happiest day of his father's life, Mathew felt he had no choice but to act, even if it meant turning everything upside down. Why didn't he choose to stay silent? He had summoned all his courage to step forward and stop his father's wedding to Rachel, the woman his father loved so deeply. But why? What dark secrets was she hiding? Mathew was about to reveal a shocking truth no one could have anticipated. His bold action brought the wedding to an immediate halt, and what unfolded afterward left everyone even more astonished. How did Mathew uncover the truth? Who was Rachel really? Join us as we dive into this intense and suspenseful story. But before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story about courage and family love touches your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more powerful stories. The sun cast a warm golden glow through the stained glass windows of the quaint chapel, filling the room with a sense of calm and beauty. It was meant to be a day of joy and celebration. Mathew clutched the small ring pillow tightly in his hands, his dark hair carefully combed and his tiny suit perfectly matching his father's elegant black tuxedo. But while his father, James, wore a bright, nervous smile, Mathew's own face was clouded with worry. Standing by his father at the front of the chapel, Mathew felt a swirl of emotions. He glanced up at James, who stood tall, anticipation sparkling in his eyes. "You look great, Dad," he whispered, managing a small smile. James beamed down at his son, giving him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "Thanks, buddy. I couldn't ask for a better ring bearer." He ruffled Mathew's hair, missing the anxiety that lingered on his son's face. As the first notes of the wedding march echoed through the chapel, the congregation rose to their feet, and all eyes turned toward the grand doors. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, guests murmuring in excitement. But while everyone else watched the doors, Mathew's gaze remained fixed on his father. His small hands gripped the ring pillow so tightly that his knuckles turned white, as though clinging to it could somehow steady his racing heart. The doors swung open and in walked Rachel, a vision in a flowing white gown adorned with lace and shimmering beads. Her golden hair cascaded in soft waves down her shoulders, her blue eyes shimmering with emotion as she took in the scene before her. James's expression softened with pure adoration, and he whispered, "You look beautiful." Rachel's lips curved in a gentle smile as she reached his side. Her voice was barely audible as she replied, "I can't wait to start our life together." The officiant began the ceremony, his words drifting over the assembled guests. For most, it was a moment of joy and reverence. But for Mathew, each passing second felt heavier, his unease growing as he remembered the moments leading up to this day. His mind drifted to the first time he'd met Rachel, and how things had slowly changed for him. Months earlier, on a crisp autumn afternoon, his father had picked him up from school with an energy Mathew hadn't seen in a long time. James had turned to him with a grin, practically bouncing in his seat. "I've got someone special for you to meet, buddy." They drove home, and Mathew's curiosity grew. It had been just the two of them since his mother's passing 2 years ago, and though he didn't say it, the idea of someone new in their lives filled him with uncertainty. When they arrived, there she was, standing on the porch, her hair catching the golden afternoon light. James's face lit up, and Mathew saw something he hadn't seen before, a spark of joy. "Mathew, this is Rachel," his father had introduced her proudly. "She's very important to me, and I hope she'll become important to you too." Rachel had knelt to his level, her eyes sparkling as she greeted him warmly. It's so wonderful to meet you, Mathew. Your dad talks about you all the time. For a brief moment, Mathew had felt hopeful, thinking maybe things would be okay. But as the weeks passed, his initial hope turned to doubt, and he started to notice something unsettling. When his father wasn't around, Rachel's warm smiles vanished, replaced by cold stares and tight, pursed lips. One evening in particular stood out. His father was working late, leaving Rachel in charge. As they sat at the dinner table, Mathew, trying to break the silence, had asked, "Miss Rachel, do you like space?" "We're learning about the solar system at school." But she hadn't even looked up from her phone. "I'm busy, Mathew. Just eat your dinner quietly, please." Her voice was sharp, dismissive, and he shrank back into his seat, stirring his food around his plate. When his dad was home, though, it was a different story. Rachel would laugh at his jokes, ask him about school, and even tousle his hair affectionately. His father didn't seem to notice the shift, basking in his own happiness. "Isn't Rachel wonderful?" James would say, his eyes shining. "We're lucky to have her, aren't we, Mathew?" Not wanting to shatter his father's happiness, Mathew would nod and force a smile, though inside he felt more isolated and confused than ever. As months went by, Rachel's true nature revealed itself even more clearly to Mathew. When James was out of earshot, she would make subtle, cutting remarks that chipped away at his confidence. Once, while working on a school project, he accidentally spilled some glue. "You're such a handful," she'd muttered with a sigh, her eyes narrowing. "I don't know how your father puts up with it." Then there were moments when he'd show her a good grade, his heart swelling with pride, only for her to respond with, "That's nice, but remember, there's always room for improvement." Each remark felt like a heavy weight pressing on him, making him feel like a burden in his own home. Around 3 months before the wedding, one incident stood out sharply in Mathew's mind. His father had gone out to run errands, leaving him and Rachel alone. Mathew was sitting in the living room, watching his favorite cartoon, when Rachel had walked in, scowling. "Turn that off," she snapped, gesturing toward the TV. "It's too loud. I'm trying to work." Startled, he fumbled with the remote, accidentally knocking over his juice, which spilled across the coffee table and onto the carpet. "I'm sorry," he cried, jumping up to grab some napkins, but before he could clean it up, Rachel was there, gripping his arm tightly. "Look what you've done," she hissed. Her face twisted with anger. "You careless little boy." Her fingers dug into his arm painfully, and tears pricked his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whimpered. "I'll clean it up, I promise." Rachel's gaze darkened, her voice cold and threatening. "You'd better," she whispered, "and if you tell your father about this, you'll regret it." He nodded quickly, his heart racing as she released him. He hurried to clean the spill, his hands trembling the entire time. That night, when his father returned, Rachel greeted him with her usual warmth, her voice cheerful as she asked him about his day. From the staircase, Mathew rubbed his sore arm, feeling a pang of loneliness and helplessness that he couldn't shake. As the wedding approached, Mathew found himself burdened with the weight of Rachel's mistreatment. He wanted to tell his father the truth, but feared his father might not believe him, or worse, that it would only make things harder for them both. One evening, about a month before the wedding, he finally gathered the courage to approach his father. Knocking timidly on his father's study door, he waited until James looked up, his expression softening. "Come in, buddy," James said, motioning him forward. "What's on your mind?" Mathew hesitated, twisting the hem of his shirt as he searched for the right words. "Dad, can I talk to you about something? It's about Rachel. I don't think she likes me very much." James's face furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean, son? Rachel adores you." Mathew swallowed hard, his words tumbling out in a rush. "No, Dad, she's different when you're not around. She ignores me and says mean things." But James just sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Mathew, I know this is a big change. It's natural to feel uncertain about Rachel becoming part of our family, but I promise she cares about you. She's trying her best." Defeated, Mathew nodded. "Okay, Dad," he murmured, retreating to his room with a heavy heart. His father hadn't wanted to believe him, and from that moment, Mathew stopped trying to explain. He withdrew further into himself, dreading each encounter with Rachel, and doing his best to keep his distance. Blissfully unaware of the tension brewing between his son and fiancée, James poured himself into the wedding preparations, his joy clouding his perception of Mathew's growing isolation. As the wedding day drew closer, Mathew's sense of dread intensified. He became quieter, more withdrawn, choosing to spend his time in his room rather than with Rachel and his father. His father, immersed in the whirlwind of wedding arrangements, dismissed Mathew's changes as shyness or pre-wedding nerves, never suspecting the silent storm his son was facing. Rachel, however, seemed to revel in her newfound power. Emboldened by Mathew's silence, she grew bolder in her behavior, her false sweetness for James more exaggerated, while her coldness toward Mathew became more open. One afternoon, Mathew overheard a conversation between Rachel and her friend Susan, which left him shaken. "I don't know how you handle him," Susan said, her voice tinged with disdain. "Playing stepmom to someone else's kid, I'd lose my mind." Mathew, hiding just around the corner, held his breath, his heart pounding. Rachel replied with a low, mocking laugh. "Oh, it's not so bad," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "He's part of the package, unfortunately. You have to take the good with the bad." They both laughed, and Mathew felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. He realized with a clarity that stung that to Rachel, he was nothing more than an inconvenient afterthought. Part of the package. A burden she was willing to tolerate for the sake of marrying his father. As the wedding day approached, the burden of keeping his secret became almost unbearable. He felt trapped, with nowhere to turn, watching helplessly as his father and Rachel made plans for a future that barely included him. One night, restless and unable to sleep, Mathew decided to get a glass of water. The house was silent as he tiptoed down the hallway in his superhero pajamas. But when he reached the living room, he froze. In the darkness, he could hear Rachel's voice, low and angry as she spoke into her phone. "Michael, you need to listen to me," she hissed, her voice sharp and tense. Peering around the corner, Mathew saw her pacing back and forth, her free hand gripping her blonde hair in frustration. "We can't rush this," she muttered. "Everything has to be perfect. The wedding is in 2 weeks, and once that's done, we move on to phase 2. Yes, the insurance policy. James doesn't suspect a thing." Mathew's young mind whirled in confusion. He knew eavesdropping was wrong, but he couldn't tear himself away. "Look, Michael, I've got it under control," Rachel snapped. "Once we get the money, we're set for life. No more scams, no more close calls. This is our ticket out." Mathew felt his breath catch in his throat. Scams? Money? Rachel's words sounded sinister, like something from a movie. And then she added, "That boy is the only problem. He's too observant, but I can handle him. James would never believe a word against me." Tears pricked at Mathew's eyes. Hearing her talk about him this way, the cold cruelty in her tone, hurt more than anything she had done before. Rachel's voice softened, her words ominous. "Just be ready. 2 weeks after the wedding, we make our move. James won't know what hit him." With that, she ended the call, and Mathew scrambled back to his room, his heart racing. He buried himself under his blankets, trying to quiet the fearful thoughts racing through his mind. Rachel was planning something bad, something involving his father's money and some sort of scheme. He didn't understand all the details, but one thing was clear. His father was in danger. The next morning, Mathew was exhausted, barely able to keep his eyes open as he sat at the breakfast table. Rachel, however, was her usual cheery self, her voice dripping with false warmth as she spoke. "Good morning, Mathew," she said with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. You look tired, sweetheart. Couldn't sleep? Mathew avoided her gaze, his mind reeling from what he had overheard. He glanced at his father, who was blissfully unaware of Rachel's true nature, and forced a weak smile. Just couldn't sleep, he mumbled. Over the next few days, Mathew's anxiety only grew. Now that he knew something was wrong, he watched Rachel closely, noticing things he had overlooked before. She was constantly on her phone, texting someone labeled M in her contacts. And whenever his father entered the room, she would quickly lock her screen and plaster on a bright, affectionate smile. Her absences also became more frequent. She made flimsy excuses to leave for hours, claiming she needed to finalize wedding details or go for last-minute dress fittings. James, blinded by love, never questioned her, but Mathew noticed everything. One afternoon, about a week before the wedding, Mathew was helping his father in the garage when Rachel's car pulled into the driveway. She hurried inside without even glancing their way. Mathew took this as his chance. "I'm gonna get a snack, Dad," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sure thing, buddy," James replied, engrossed in fixing the lawnmower. "Grab me a soda while you're at it, will you?" Mathew entered the house quietly, listening for Rachel. He heard her muffled voice coming from upstairs. Moving carefully to avoid the creaky third step, he climbed the stairs and stopped just outside the guest room. "Michael, we're almost there," she was saying in a low voice. "Just a few more days. Keep calm." Mathew pressed closer, straining to hear. "The policy is ironclad," Rachel continued. "Once we're married, it'll be easy. A tragic accident, a grieving widow, and we're set for life. Just stick to the plan." Mathew's blood ran cold. A tragic accident? Were they planning to hurt his father? Just then the door creaked as he leaned in too close, and the room fell silent. His heart leaped into his throat. "I've got to go," Rachel said quickly. "I'll call you later." Mathew hurried down the hallway, ducking into the bathroom just as the guest room door opened. He pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding, waiting until he heard her footsteps receding down the stairs. Only then did he allow himself to breathe again. This was worse than he'd imagined. Rachel wasn't just after his father's money. She was planning to hurt him. Maybe even kill him. Mathew couldn't bear the thought. But who would believe him? His father was completely taken by Rachel, and she'd made it clear she could twist anything he said against him. For the next few days, Mathew watched her every move, trying to piece together her plan. She was careful, but sometimes she slipped up. One evening, he walked into the study to find her hurriedly closing his father's laptop. She jumped when she saw him, a guilty look flashing across her face. "Oh, Mathew," she said, her voice overly bright. "You startled me. I was just checking some wedding RSVPs." Mathew nodded, hiding his suspicion. As soon as she left the room, he opened the laptop. It was locked, but he knew his father's password, his birthday. He typed it in and was relieved when the screen unlocked. One tab remained open, the website of a major life insurance company. His stomach twisted with fear. This had to be the policy she kept mentioning. He was about to read further when he heard footsteps approaching and quickly closed the laptop, pretending to look at the bookshelf just as his father entered. "Hey, sport," James said with a smile. "What are you up to?" "Just looking for a book," Mathew replied, hating how easily he had to lie. His father ruffled his hair, chuckling. "That's my boy, always with his nose in a book. Come on, dinner's ready." As they walked to the dining room, Mathew's mind raced. He knew he had to stop Rachel somehow, but he didn't know how. He was just a kid, up against two grown adults with a dangerous plan. The next day, Mathew got his chance. His father had a last-minute meeting at work, and Rachel was out, leaving him alone in the house. With shaking hands, he opened Rachel's sleek silver laptop. It was password-protected, of course, but he tried a few guesses, her birthday, the wedding date, without success. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed a yellow sticky note poking out from under the laptop. Peeling it back, he saw a string of numbers and letters. Could it be? He typed in the code, heart pounding, and the laptop sprang to life. Matthew's eyes widened as he scrolled through her files. There were dozens of documents with names like policy, will, and schedule. He clicked on one labeled insurance policy and saw words like accidental death, double indemnity, and payout of $5 million. The breath left his body. That was the price she'd put on his father's life. He continued searching and found a folder labeled Michael. Inside were photos of a man he'd never seen before. Tall, dark-haired, with a scar above his left eyebrow. Some photos showed him alone. In others, he was with Rachel, looking very much like a couple. Mathew felt sick. Rachel wasn't just planning to hurt his father. She was cheating on him with this man, too. Suddenly, he heard a car in the driveway. Rachel was back. In a panic, Mathew closed all the windows and shut down the laptop, placing it exactly as he'd found it just as the front door opened. "Mathew?" Rachel called, her voice echoing through the house. "Yeah," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just doing homework." She appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "Don't you usually work in your room?" Mathew shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "It's quieter here." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before offering a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, don't work too hard. Dinner will be ready soon." As she turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of her phone screen. She was texting someone labeled M. His blood ran cold. That night, Mathew lay in bed, overwhelmed by the weight of everything he'd uncovered. He couldn't sit back and let Rachel's plan unfold. Somehow, he had to stop this wedding and protect his father. And so, as he finally drifted off to sleep, his resolve hardened. He would do whatever it took to keep his father safe, no matter the cost. On the wedding day, Mathew stood beside his father at the altar, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. The officiant began to speak, but his words were a blur to Mathew, who could focus only on the danger looming over them. If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The traditional words hung in the air, and Mathew knew this was his chance. But fear gripped him. What if no one believed him? What if he was wrong? The officiant nodded, about to continue, when Mathew's voice broke through the silence. "Wait," he said, his voice small but steady. "Stop the wedding." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as every eye turned to him. James looked down, confusion and concern etched on his face. "Mathew, what's wrong, buddy?" Mathew's gaze darted from his father to Rachel, who was staring at him with barely concealed anger. "Dad, you can't marry her," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "She's not who you think she is." James knelt down, placing a gentle hand on Mathew's shoulder. "What are you talking about, son? Are you feeling okay?" "No, Dad," Mathew insisted, shaking his head. "She's planning something bad." The guests murmured among themselves, casting confused glances at Mathew, who stood rigid, gathering the courage to reveal everything he had discovered. The weight of his secret, of all he had seen and heard, pressed down on him like a stone. Rachel's voice cut through the tension with a nervous laugh, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of anger. "Oh, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "I know this is a big change for you. Having a new mom can be scary, but this isn't the right way to express it." The condescending tone in her voice ignited a spark of anger in Mathew. He looked up, meeting her gaze, his young eyes fierce with determination. "No," he said, his voice rising. "That's not it. I know what you're doing. I heard you on the phone with Michael. I know about the insurance policy. You're planning to hurt Dad." Gasps rippled through the room, and Rachel's face paled, her carefully constructed mask of sweetness slipping. James turned to his fiancée, his face etched with confusion and growing horror. "Rachel," he said, his voice shaking. What is he talking about? She forced a laugh, a hollow, almost hysterical sound. James, you can't believe this, she cried, her voice straining to keep calm. Michael is our wedding planner. Of course, we've discussed insurance for the ceremony and the costs for catering. Mathew must have misunderstood. But Mathew wasn't backing down. He had come too far to let her twist the truth again. No, he insisted, his voice breaking with emotion. I saw the insurance policy on your computer. It's for millions of dollars if Dad dies. And I saw pictures of you with Michael. He's not just your wedding planner. The crowd erupted in a mixture of whispers and shocked glances, some guests craning their necks to get a better view of the drama unfolding at the altar. Some looked scandalized, others concerned, as they watched the bride's face drain of color. James stood frozen, looking between his son and his bride-to-be. His face was a mask of disbelief, pain, and confusion. Rachel's smile had vanished entirely, her calm facade crumbling under the weight of Mathew's accusations. James, she said, reaching for his hand, her voice laced with desperation. You know me. You know I would never. This is absurd. Mathew is just a child. He doesn't understand what he's saying. James, his voice laced with pain, looked down at his son. Mathew, he said slowly, his voice heavy with emotion. Are you absolutely sure about this? Mathew nodded vigorously, tears welling in his eyes. I wouldn't lie about this, Dad. She's been mean to me for months when you're not around. And now she's planning to hurt you. Please, you have to believe me. James turned back to Rachel, his eyes clouded with confusion, hurt, and suspicion. Rachel, he said, his voice low and strained, is there any truth to this? Any at all? For a moment, Rachel looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting around the room, taking in the shocked faces of the guests, the stern expression of the officiant, and the pleading eyes of Mathew. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, her demeanor changed. Her eyes hardened, her mouth set in a grim line. This is ridiculous, she spat, her voice no longer carrying the sweetness she had used to disguise herself for so long. She turned to the stunned crowd, her voice rising in indignation. I don't have to stand here and be accused by a spoiled brat who can't handle sharing his daddy's attention. The guests gasped in shock at her outburst, and James's face twisted with disbelief. Rachel continued, her voice laced with venom. Mathew clearly has some issues we need to address as a family. James, perhaps we should postpone this until we can sort this out. But James cut her off, his voice now steady and unyielding. No, Rachel, I think we need to address this now, because if there's even a shred of truth to what Mathew is saying. Rachel's eyes flashed dangerously, her voice rising in desperation. You can't be serious, James. You're going to believe the wild imaginings of an 8-year-old over me, the woman you love. James's gaze didn't waver. I love my son too, Rachel, and Mathew has never lied to me before. He's not the type to make up stories, especially not about something like this. Mathew felt a surge of relief and gratitude wash over him. His father was finally listening, finally seeing the truth. But Rachel wasn't done yet. Her face contorted in fury as she turned to him, her eyes blazing with anger. You little brat, she hissed, forgetting herself in front of the entire congregation. You've ruined everything. A shocked murmur ran through the guests, who now watched Rachel with expressions of horror and disbelief. James took a step back, his face pale as he looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. Rachel, he whispered, his voice barely audible. What have you done? Realizing her mistake, Rachel quickly forced a laugh, attempting to backtrack. Oh, James, can't you see? She said, her voice shaky but desperate. This is all too much. The stress, the ridiculous accusations, it's just too much. I lost my temper. Surely you can understand. But the damage was done. James took another step back, his gaze fixed on her. No, he said, his voice filled with a finality that left no room for argument. No, I don't think I can understand. Because the Rachel I thought I knew would never speak to my son that way, no matter how upset she was. Turning to Mathew, he knelt down, looking his son in the eyes with a mixture of sadness and regret. "Mathew," he said gently, "I need you to tell me everything. Don't leave anything out." With all eyes on him, Mathew took a deep breath and began to recount the last few months. He told his father about Rachel's cold behavior when they were alone, the hurtful comments, and the physical intimidation. He shared the overheard phone conversation, the suspicious absences, the secret messages. He described finding the insurance policy on her computer and the photos of her with Michael. As Mathew spoke, James's face grew increasingly pale, his expression shifting from disbelief to heartbreak as the pieces began to fall into place. Some of the guests shook their heads, unable to believe what they were hearing, while others nodded, as if the truth was slowly coming together. Rachel stood rigid, her eyes darting between James and the exit. Her carefully crafted facade had crumbled, and by the time Mathew finished his story, she looked nothing like the radiant bride who had walked down the aisle just moments before. James turned back to her, his voice heavy with pain and betrayal. "Rachel," he said, his voice low, "look me in the eye and tell me none of this is true." Rachel's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her once warm, affectionate eyes now held only cold calculation. And in that moment, James saw the truth for what it was. It broke his heart. He took a deep breath, his voice barely steady. "I think," he said, each word deliberate, "that this wedding is over." Chaos erupted in the church as guests began to stand, some moving toward the exits, others crowding closer to hear what was happening. In the midst of the commotion, Rachel saw her chance. With a frustrated snarl, she turned and bolted down the aisle, her white dress billowing behind her like a ghostly apparition. "Stop her!" someone shouted, but Rachel was quick. She burst through the church doors and out into the bright sunlight, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. James, still reeling from the shocking revelation, snapped into action. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "Yes, hello," he said, his voice trembling. "I need to report a crime. My fiancée, she was planning to kill me for insurance money. She just ran from our wedding. Please, you need to find her." As he provided the dispatcher with Rachel's description and last known direction, Mathew stood beside him, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. He had saved his father, but at the cost of watching the man he loved and admired face the shattering truth about someone he had trusted. The guests, who only minutes ago had been gathered in celebration, now buzzed with shock and speculation. Some rushed outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the fleeing bride, while others huddled in small groups, whispering furiously and casting worried glances at James and Mathew. After ending the call, James turned to his son, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He knelt down and placed his hands on Mathew's shoulders, his voice thick with emotion. "Mathew," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I am so sorry. I should have listened to you sooner. I should have seen it." Mathew threw his arms around his father's neck, his small voice filled with relief. "It's okay, Dad," he mumbled. "I'm just glad you're safe." James held his son tightly, tears welling in his eyes. For a moment, the chaos around them faded away, and it was just the two of them, father and son, united against the storm. Their embrace was interrupted by the arrival of the police, who entered the church with a sense of urgency, immediately commanding attention. The murmurs of the guests quieted as they turned to watch. One of the officers approached them, a serious expression on his face. "Mr. Williams?" he asked. James nodded, keeping one arm protectively around Mathew. "Yes, that's me." The officer introduced himself as Officer Garcia and his partner as Officer Lopez. "We need to ask you some questions about what happened here," he said, his tone respectful but firm. As James began recounting the events, Mathew's attention was drawn to a commotion near the church entrance. A tall man with dark hair and a scar above his left eyebrow was trying to push his way inside, looking frantic. Matthew's heart leaped into his throat. He recognized the man from the photos on Rachel's computer. It was Michael. "Dad," Matthew whispered urgently, tugging on his father's sleeve. "Dad, that's him. That's Michael." James's head snapped up, his eyes widening as he followed his son's gaze, remembering the description Matthew had given earlier. "Officers," James said quickly, "that man by the door. I think he's involved in this. He's the one my son overheard Rachel talking to on the phone." Officer Garcia reacted swiftly, his expression hardening as he gave a nod to Officer Lopez, who moved quickly toward Michael, who was now trying to back away. "Sir, stop right there," Officer Lopez called out, his voice echoing through the church. Michael froze, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. And then, in a burst of panic, he turned and ran. As Michael sprinted from the church, Officer Lopez raced after him, calling into his radio for backup. The remaining wedding guests murmured in shock, watching as the man fled the scene, their minds reeling from the turn of events. Meanwhile, Officer Garcia turned back to James and Matthew. "Mr. Williams," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "it would be best if you and your son came down to the station. We'll need a detailed statement from both of you regarding Rachel's plans and Michael's involvement." James, still visibly shaken, nodded, putting a protective arm around Matthew's shoulders. "Of course," he agreed, his voice hollow but resolute. "We'll help in any way we can." As they prepared to leave, James's best man, Paul, approached him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "James," he said quietly, his tone filled with sympathy, "what should we tell everyone here? Do you want us to?" James, looking around at the stunned faces of friends and family, managed a weak smile. "I think it's best if you ask everyone to head home," he said, his voice strained. "Please, thank them for coming, and apologize on my behalf. I just can't deal with this right now." Paul nodded understandingly. "Don't worry about it, James. I'll take care of everything here. You focus on getting this sorted with Matthew." With one last supportive squeeze on James's shoulder, Paul turned back to the crowd, his voice steady as he addressed the guests and gently ushered them out. As James and Matthew left the church with Officer Garcia, the weight of the day's events pressed heavily upon them, leaving them silent as they rode to the police station. Inside the police station, James and Matthew were led to a quiet room, its plain walls and sterile lighting a stark contrast to the ornate church they had just left. Officer Garcia assured them it was simply a quiet space where they could talk without interruption, not an interrogation room. For the next few hours, James and Matthew recounted the events of the past few months to Officer Garcia, piecing together every suspicious incident and hidden discovery that had led up to this day. Matthew described overhearing Rachel's late-night conversations with Michael, the cruel remarks she made when his father wasn't around, and the physical intimidation she used to keep him silent. He shared how he'd found the insurance policy, noticed the photos of Rachel with Michael, and witnessed the secretive messages between the two. As Matthew talked, James's face grew increasingly pale. He added details where he could, explaining how Rachel had come into his life, her apparent charm, and the subtle ways she'd encouraged him to increase his life insurance policy, just in case. He realized now that Rachel had systematically worked to isolate him from friends and family, gradually encouraging him to focus all his attention on her. When their statements were complete, Officer Garcia nodded thoughtfully, his expression a mix of sympathy and professionalism. "It sounds like Rachel, or whoever she really is, had been planning this for some time," he said. "People like her. They're often professionals at manipulation and deceit. It's not your fault, Mr. Williams." James nodded slowly, his hand resting on Matthew's shoulder. He felt a mix of relief and sorrow as he processed the truth about Rachel. Despite his initial guilt, He knew that Mathew's bravery had saved them both. As the day turned into evening, more details began to emerge. Officer Lopez eventually returned to the station, having managed to catch up with Michael. Under questioning, Michael quickly cracked, spilling the full extent of his and Rachel's elaborate plan. He revealed that Rachel's real name was actually Sarah Connors, a seasoned con artist with a long history of targeting wealthy men. The pair had been running cons together for years, though their plot against James had been their most ambitious and deadly scheme yet. The insurance policy that Mathew had discovered was only the beginning. Sarah had manipulated James into changing his will, isolating him from his loved ones and painting herself as the only person he could trust. The ultimate plan had been to stage a tragic accident during their honeymoon, allowing Sarah to collect both the life insurance payout and James's estate. From there, she and Michael had planned to disappear, ready to start over with a new life and another identity. As Officer Garcia filled James in on these details, a new wave of realization washed over him. He felt a deep sense of betrayal, one that seemed almost impossible to shake. Sarah's deception had cut deep, affecting not only his sense of security, but also the trust he had placed in her. Beside him, Mathew sat quietly, still processing everything that had come to light. Officer Garcia offered them both a sympathetic nod as he gathered his notes. "You're fortunate, Mr. Williams," he said gently. "Your son saved your life. If not for Mathew's courage, things could have ended very differently." James turned to his son, his face a mixture of pride and guilt. "You're right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mathew saved my life today. I only wish I had listened to him sooner." Mathew leaned into his father, feeling a surge of love and relief. "It's okay, Dad," he whispered. "We're safe now, and that's what matters." As the night wore on, the police continued their search for Sarah, who had seemingly vanished into thin air after fleeing the church. Officer Garcia explained that they had alerted all local and state law enforcement, issuing a warrant for her arrest. They were monitoring airports, bus stations, and car rental agencies, though they warned James and Mathew that Sarah was highly skilled at evading capture. Before they left, Officer Garcia handed James a business card. "If you remember anything else, or if she tries to contact you, don't hesitate to call us immediately," he said, "day or night." James pocketed the card, then turned to Mathew, a weary smile on his face. "Ready to go home, buddy?" Mathew nodded, feeling the exhaustion of the day's events weighing heavily on him. As they drove back through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, a strange sense of calm began to settle over them. For the first time in months, there were no secrets between them, only the reassurance of having each other. Pulling into the driveway, James turned off the car engine and looked over at his son. He seemed lost in thought for a moment, then took a deep breath, his voice soft. "Mathew, I owe you an apology, a big one." Mathew looked up at his father, surprised. "For what, Dad?" James sighed heavily, regret lacing his voice. "For not listening to you, for not seeing how Sarah was treating you, for putting you in danger by bringing her into our lives." Mathew thought for a moment, his young face wise beyond his years. "You couldn't have known, Dad. You just wanted to be happy. I didn't want to ruin it for you." James's heart broke at his son's words, and he reached out, pulling Mathew into a fierce hug. "You're never the problem, Mathew," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You're the best thing in my life, and I'm so sorry if I ever made you feel otherwise." They sat there for a long moment, holding each other as the emotional weight of the past few months finally lifted. After a while, James pulled back, a small smile breaking through the tears. "What do you say we go inside and order an obscene amount of pizza? I think we've earned it." Mathew managed a grin. "Can we get stuffed crust?" James laughed, the sound still tinged with the lingering sadness of the day, but filled with warmth. "Anything you want, buddy. After today, you can have whatever you want." As they entered the house, both James and Mathew felt an unfamiliar but welcome sense of peace. The shadow of Sarah's betrayal still lingered, but for now, they were safe and they had each other. Over the following weeks, James and Mathew worked together to rebuild their lives. There were more interviews with the police, endless calls from friends and family, and even inquiries from reporters wanting details about the dramatic wedding day. James did his best to shield Mathew from the worst of it, but there was no escaping the reality of what had happened. Sarah remained at large, seemingly having vanished without a trace. The police continued their search, but as the days turned into weeks, the hope of finding her began to fade. Michael, on the other hand, was facing the full weight of the law. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided the police with extensive information about Sarah's past scams and their network of associates, revealing a trail of broken hearts and stolen money spanning multiple states. For Mathew, the aftermath of that day was a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. While he was glad that his father was safe, he couldn't shake the fear that Sarah might return someday to seek revenge. Sensing his son's unease, James took extra precautions. He installed a new security system, complete with cameras and motion sensors, and reassured Mathew that he could come to him with any concern, no matter how small. "Remember, we're a team, buddy," James would say, ruffling Mathew's hair. "You and me against the world." Mathew would nod, feeling a little safer each time his father reaffirmed their bond. Slowly, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. James threw himself into his work, taking on extra projects to keep his mind occupied. Mathew focused on school, finding comfort in the familiar routines of classes and homework. He even developed a newfound interest in detective novels, joking that he had a head start in the mystery-solving department. One Saturday morning, about a month after the fateful wedding day, James and Mathew were having breakfast when the doorbell rang. James tensed, still wary of unexpected visitors, but relaxed when he saw Paul through the peephole. "Hey man," Paul said as James opened the door. "How are you guys holding up?" James managed a tired smile. "We're getting by. Come on in." Paul followed him to the kitchen, where Mathew was finishing his cereal. "Hey little man," Paul said, giving Mathew a fist bump. "You doing okay?" Mathew nodded, returning the fist bump with a small smile. He had always liked Paul, who treated him like a person rather than just a kid. "So," Paul said, accepting a cup of coffee from James, "the guys and I have been talking, and we think it's time for you two to get out of the house for a bit. What do you say to a camping trip next weekend?" James hesitated, glancing at Mathew. "I don't know, Paul, with everything that's happened." "That's exactly why you need it," Paul insisted. "Just a few days away from all this," he said, gesturing vaguely around the kitchen. "No phones, no reporters, no lawyers, just the guys, some tents, and the great outdoors." Mathew perked up at the idea. "Can we go fishing?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with excitement for the first time in weeks. Paul grinned. "You bet, buddy. We'll catch enough fish to feed an army." Looking at his son's hopeful face, James felt something shift inside him. Maybe this was exactly what they needed, a chance to breathe, to remember what life was like before Sarah came into their world. "All right," he said, smiling as Mathew's face lit up. "Let's do it." The camping trip turned out to be exactly what James and Mathew needed. Away from the reminders of Sarah's betrayal, they spent their days hiking, fishing, and telling stories around the campfire. Mathew delighted in learning how to set up a tent and roast marshmallows, while James rediscovered the simple joy of watching his son laugh and play without a care in the world. On their last night in the woods, as they sat around the dying embers of their campfire, James pulled Mathew close. "Thank you, buddy," he said softly. Mathew looked up, confused. "For what, Dad?" James smiled, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. for being brave, for seeing what I couldn't see, and for saving us both. Mathew snuggled closer to his father, feeling safe and loved. We saved each other, Dad, he said wisely. As they drove home the next day, both James and Mathew felt renewed. The shadow of Sarah still loomed in the background, but it no longer seemed all-consuming. They had weathered the storm together and come out stronger for it. Life continued to move forward. Mathew threw himself into his studies, excelling in school and making new friends. James, with the encouragement of his therapist, began to cautiously re-enter the dating scene, though he was understandably wary and took things very slowly. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, James received an unexpected visit from Officer Garcia. He invited the officer inside, noticing the grave look on his face. "Mr. Williams," Officer Garcia began, "we found Sarah." James's heart raced. "You've arrested her?" Officer Garcia shook his head slowly. "No, sir. I'm afraid we found her body in a motel room outside of Las Vegas. It appears she took her own life." The news hit James like a physical blow. He stumbled back, steadying himself against the wall. She's dead?" Officer Garcia nodded. "We believe she'd been there for a few days. She left a note." At that moment, Mathew came downstairs, stopping short when he saw the officer. "Dad?" he asked, his voice tinged with worry. James took a deep breath, motioning for his son to join him. "Mathew, we need to talk." They sat together in the living room as Officer Garcia gently explained what had happened. Sarah, or rather the person they'd known as Rachel, had been on the run for months, staying just a step ahead of the law. But the pressure had finally taken its toll. She expressed remorse for what she'd done, Officer Garcia said, his voice soft. She said she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. James sat in silence, one arm wrapped protectively around Mathew. He felt a complex mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. After Officer Garcia left, Mathew looked up at his father, his face filled with concern. "Are you okay, Dad?" James managed a weak smile. "I don't know, buddy, but we're safe now, and that's what matters." The news of Sarah's death marked a turning point for both James and Mathew. While it brought closure, it also stirred up a range of emotions that took time to process. They attended counseling together, learning to navigate their feelings and strengthen their bond. As the months passed, life began to settle into a new normal. James threw himself into fatherhood, cherishing every moment with Mathew. He rekindled friendships that had fallen by the wayside during his relationship with Sarah, rebuilding his support network. Mathew, for his part, blossomed, excelling in school and developing a passion for detective novels. On the 1-year anniversary of the wedding day, James and Mathew decided to start a new tradition. They packed a picnic and spent the day hiking and fishing at a nearby state park. As they sat by a crystal-clear lake watching the sunset, James turned to his son. "You know, Mathew," he said thoughtfully, "I realized something important over this past year. Sarah's betrayal taught me a valuable lesson." Mathew looked up, curious. "What's that, Dad?" James smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "It taught me that the most important relationship in my life is right here." He placed a hand over Mathew's heart. "You and me, buddy, we're a team, and that's never going to change." Mathew beamed, throwing his arms around his father. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, kiddo," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. "More than you'll ever know." As they packed up their picnic and headed home, both father and son felt a sense of peace settle over them. They had weathered the storm together, emerging stronger and closer than ever. And as they drove home, the setting sun casting brilliant hues of orange and pink across the sky, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The story of Mathew's bravery became a tale of resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond between a father and son. A reminder that sometimes the most profound love stories are born not from fairy tale weddings, but from the simple, enduring love of family.